The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days, but inside the Sterling estate, nobody noticed the storm outside. They were too busy admiring their own reflections in the polished marble floor, too busy rehearsing the smiles they'd wear when the money finally became real. Arthur Sterling was 2 weeks in the ground, and already the mansion smelled less like grief and more like ambition. Elias stood near the back of the room, the way he always had. 5 years he'd spent in this house, not as family, but as something closer to furniture that occasionally fetched tea. He remembered the winter Arthur's hands had started shaking too badly to sign his own checks, and how Elias had learned to forge that signature just well enough to keep the business running, just badly enough that only Arthur would ever know the difference. Nobody else had noticed. Nobody else had cared to. Marcus arrived first, of course, trailing the scent of cologne that cost more than Elias's monthly wage. Julian followed a few minutes later, phone already out, thumb scrolling through a listing for a Bugatti he hadn't paid for yet but was certain he would. Their sisters came in a cluster of perfume and practiced tears, dabbing at eyes that hadn't produced a single real one since the funeral. Elias watched them settle into the front row like it was owed to them. In a way, he supposed it was. They had always been the ones Arthur introduced at galas, the ones whose photographs sat in silver frames on the mantel. Elias had never once appeared in a photograph in this house. He told himself it didn't matter. He had stopped believing that a long time ago. The doors opened, and Mr. Henderson walked in carrying a leather folder thick enough to hold a man's entire life inside it. The room went quiet the way a courtroom goes quiet before a verdict. Not out of respect, but out of hunger. Henderson set the folder down with the deliberate slowness of a man who had delivered 100 wills and enjoyed the theater of every single one. He didn't sit. He preferred to stand when he read, as though gravity itself owed the moment some ceremony. "We shall begin with the primary assets," he said, and the room leaned forward as one body. Marcus got the Manhattan penthouse first, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the one Arthur had bought the year the company went public. Marcus didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd always known. Then came the fleet. For vintage Ferraris, garaged and waxed, each one a monument to a man Arthur had built and Marcus had never once helped run. Julian's name came next. The Napa Vineyard, sprawling and sun-drenched, along with 3 numbered accounts in Zurich that Henderson read off with the flat tone of a man reciting a grocery list. Julian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the funeral. He caught his sister's eye and winked. The sisters received what sisters and families like this always received. Jewelry passed down through generations. Trust funds structured to release in careful increments. Enough to ensure a lifetime of comfort without a single year of consequence. They wept properly this time, the kind of tears that come easier once the number attached to them is finally spoken aloud. Elias sat through all of it without moving. He wasn't counting the millions, he'd stopped doing math like that years ago. He was watching their faces, searching for even a flicker of the man who'd raised them, some inherited kindness passed down along with the fortune. He found none, only appetite wearing very expensive suits. Henderson turned the page. The room's energy shifted, the way air shifts before a door opens onto cold weather. There was only one name left in the folder, and everyone in that room had already forgotten it belonged to a person at all. "And to my nephew, Elias Thorne," Henderson read, and for the first time all afternoon, every head in the room turned toward the back. Marcus smirked the way he used to when they were children and Elias was the one sent to fetch things. Julian didn't even bother hiding his laugh. It came out low and easy, a man already certain of the punchline. The sisters exchanged a glance that said what none of them would say aloud. What could Arthur possibly have left the help? Henderson reached into the leather folder and withdrew a small velvet pouch, worn soft at the corners with age. He loosened the drawstring and tipped it over his palm. A single key fell out. Iron, rusted along its teeth. The kind of object that looked like it belonged buried in a drawer of things nobody had the heart to throw away. "The key to the cellar of the original Sterling farmhouse," Henderson said, reading from the page as though the absurdity of it demanded no commentary of his own. "Located in rural Ohio. And nothing more." The silence lasted exactly as long as it took the room to understand he wasn't joking. Then it broke. Julian's laugh came first, sharp and delighted. The kind of sound a man makes when the universe finally confirms what he'd always suspected about his own worth compared to someone else's. A rusty key, he managed between breaths. For the servant boy. God, that's perfect. Marcus didn't laugh as loud, but his smile was worse. Slow, satisfied. Final. Don't lose it, Elias, he said, not even bothering to look over. Might fetch you 3 cents at a scrapyard. The sisters didn't laugh, but they didn't stop it either. One of them dabbed at her eyes again, though this time it looked less like grief and more like she was hiding a smile behind the handkerchief. Elias rose from his chair. He crossed the room in silence, took the key from Henderson's palm, and felt its full, cold weight settle into his hand. It was heavier than it looked. He would think about that detail later, turn it over in his mind on the long drive that followed. How something so small could carry so much weight, and how none of them, not one, had thought to ask why. The drive to Ohio took 12 hours, and Elias spent every one of them in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of company. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't stop to eat until the hunger became impossible to ignore. Somewhere past the Pennsylvania border, the highway lights thinned out into darkness, and the key sat on the passenger seat beside him like something waiting to be asked a question. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He didn't cry now. He had spent 5 years learning exactly how much of himself he was allowed to show in that house, and the habit didn't break just because the house no longer had a claim on him. The farmhouse, when he finally found it, was barely still a house at all. Weeds had climbed halfway up the porch columns, and the roof sagged in the middle like something exhausted from decades of standing. This was where the sterling fortune had begun, before Manhattan penthouses and Napa vineyards, before any of them had learned to mistake inheritance for identity. Arthur had mentioned it exactly once, years ago, in the offhand way people mention places they've buried on purpose. Elias pushed through the front door, its hinges shrieking in protest, and made his way toward the back of the house where Arthur had once said the cellar entrance was hidden beneath the kitchen floor. He found it under a rug thick with dust and mouse droppings, not a trapdoor but something far heavier. A steel hatch, industrial and out of place in a house built a century before such steel existed. His hand trembled slightly as he fit the rusted key into the lock. It seemed impossible that something so old and neglected could match a mechanism so deliberately reinforced. But the key turned, smooth as if it had been oiled yesterday, and the hatch released with a groan of metal that echoed up through the empty house. Elias descended the narrow stairs into darkness, phone flashlight trembling in his hand, bracing himself for mildew and cobwebs and perhaps a few old boxes not worth the drive. What he found instead made him stop breathing entirely. A motion sensor clicked somewhere in the dark, and the room around him flooded with light, clean, white, humming light, the kind that belonged in a bank vault, not beneath a crumbling farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. For a long moment, Elias simply stood at the bottom of the stairs, unable to make his mind agree with what his eyes were showing him. The cellar he had imagined, dirt floor, cobwebs, maybe a few crates of forgotten farm tools, did not exist. In its place was a room that belonged nowhere near rural Ohio. Reinforced walls, a climate control unit humming softly in one corner, rows of steel filing cabinets lining the walls like silent sentries. At the center of it all sat a desk, and on the desk, a computer terminal, sleek, modern, entirely out of place beside the century-old stone foundation surrounding it. Beside the terminal sat a stack of black leather binders, each one embossed with a small silver seal Elias didn't recognize. His footsteps echoed as he crossed the room, his earlier exhaustion from the drive forgotten entirely. He ran his fingers along the spines of the binders before pulling the first one free. The leather was cool and unworn, as if it had been handled carefully, maybe even recently, by someone who never wanted the pages inside disturbed by dust or damage. He opened it. The first page bore a single typed line. Sterling Holdings, Internal Record, Volume 1. Elias sat down slowly in the chair behind the desk, the old wood creaking beneath him, and began to read. His breath caught somewhere in the second paragraph and didn't fully return for the rest of the night. These weren't old farm ledgers or forgotten family photographs. These were records, detailed, dated, meticulously kept. Of transactions Arthur Sterling had never spoken a word of to anyone in his family. Wire transfers routed through shell companies. Names of officials paid to look away from zoning violations. Dates that lined up, uncomfortably, with years Elias remembered his cousins celebrating business wins that had always seemed to come a little too easily. He turned another page and another, the vault's silence pressing in around him, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control and the sound of his own heartbeat, which had begun to race in a way it hadn't since he was a boy waiting to see if his father would come home. Whatever Arthur Sterling had built his empire on, he had never intended it to disappear with him. He had simply been waiting for the right person to find it. Elias didn't know how long he sat there before he noticed the second stack, half hidden beneath the last binder. Not ledgers this time, but a single legal document, its pages crisp and untouched, stamped with the seal of a law firm he had never heard Arthur mention. Not Henderson's firm. Someone else entirely. He unfolded it carefully, the way a person handles something they suspect might change everything before they've even finished reading it. The title alone made his hands go still. Instrument of Final Command, Sterling Holdings Trust. He read it once, too fast to understand it. He read it again, slower, forcing himself to absorb every clause. The Manhattan penthouse Marcus had claimed so easily. The Napa Vineyard Julian had already begun planning renovations for. The trust funds, the accounts, the jewelry, every asset distributed that afternoon in that gleaming room back in New York. None of it, the document explained in language too precise to argue with, had ever truly belonged to them. Every one of those assets sat inside a single holding company. And the sole ownership of that holding company was not determined by name, or by bloodline, or by the will Henderson had read aloud. It was determined by possession of the key. Guardian of the key, the document called it 3 times, as though Arthur had wanted to be certain no lawyer, no judge, no disbelieving heir could later claim the language was accidental. Whoever held the rusted iron key that had made Julian laugh so hard he'd needed to catch his breath. Whoever had opened this vault and read this document became, by Arthur's own hand, the sole controlling owner of everything the Sterling name had ever touched. Elias sat back in the chair, the document trembling slightly in his grip, though the room around him was utterly still. He thought of Marcus's smirk. He thought of Julian's laughter, the 3 cents at the scrapyard. He thought of the sisters, dabbing at eyes that had never once looked at him with anything close to recognition. Arthur hadn't forgotten him in that will. Arthur had done the opposite. He had given the others the illusion of a fortune, and given Elias, quietly, without a single word of explanation, the truth of who actually owned it. Elias didn't move for a long time. The document sat open on his lap, its language too precise to be anything but deliberate, and somewhere beneath the shock, a colder thought began to settle in. Arthur hadn't just left him ownership. He had left him a choice, and Arthur had known exactly how long it would take Elias to make it. He thought about the nights he'd sat beside Arthur's bed in those final months. Back when the old man's hands shook too badly to hold a pen and his mind drifted in and out like a radio losing signal. Arthur had said strange things in those hours. Things Elias had dismissed as the fog of medication and fear. "You're the only one who never asked me for anything," he'd said once, so quietly Elias had almost missed it. At the time it had sounded like nothing. Now it sounded like the first line of a will Arthur had been writing for years, long before Henderson ever put pen to paper. Elias closed the binder slowly and set the document beside it. He wasn't shaking anymore. What he felt instead was something quieter and far more dangerous. A clarity he hadn't known in 5 years of shrinking himself small enough to survive in that house. He turned to the computer terminal. The screen woke at a single keystroke. No password required. As though Arthur had built this last piece of the puzzle to open the moment the right hands touched it. A single folder sat on the desktop, Recovery Protocol. Elias hovered the cursor over it for a long moment. He thought of Marcus's laugh. He thought of Julian's voice. "Don't lose it, Elias," tossed off so carelessly, like a joke that cost him nothing. He thought of every year he'd spent invisible in that house, mistaken for furniture by people who would have starved without someone quietly holding their world together. He clicked it open. The screen filled with lines of code Elias didn't fully understand, but understanding wasn't required, only confirmation. A single button sat at the bottom of the interface, plain and unadorned. Execute recovery. He pressed it. Nothing dramatic happened in the vault itself. No lights flickered. No alarm sounded. Just a small line of text scrolling across the screen, confirming what he had just set into motion hundreds of miles away, in a city that had no idea its ground was shifting beneath it. Back in Manhattan, the celebration hadn't slowed since the reading of the will. Champagne bottles, the expensive kind Arthur used to reserve for closing deals, sat open across the penthouse's marble counters. Marcus had his jacket off, sleeves rolled. Laughing with a business partner about the Ferraris he planned to have shipped out west by the weekend. Julian was 3 drinks in, already toasting to Napa, already imagining himself standing on a porch that legally, as of tonight, had never been his to imagine. The first phone buzzed just after midnight. Marcus barely glanced at it. A payment notification, probably nothing. Then Julian's phone buzzed too, and one of the sisters, and within minutes the room had gone from celebration to confusion. Phones lighting up one after another like dominoes falling in sequence nobody had chosen. Transaction declined. Account frozen, immediate review required. Foreclosure notice issued. Marcus stared at his screen, certain it had to be a glitch, some bank error that would resolve itself by morning. He didn't yet understand that nothing about tonight was going to resolve itself. Somewhere in Ohio, a rusted key sat on a desk beside an open binder, and the man they had mocked that afternoon was no longer the quiet nephew who fetched their tea. He was, as of tonight, the only person in that family whose name actually meant something. The lights went first. Marcus was mid-sentence, phone pressed to his ear, screaming at a bank representative who had no answers to give him, when the penthouse windows suddenly dimmed and the hum of the building's climate system cut out entirely. For a moment, everyone assumed a city-wide outage. Then the emergency lighting kicked in. Just the penthouse, no other floor, no other building, and Marcus understood, with a sickness rising in his stomach, that this was not a coincidence. Julian had already dialed Henderson 4 times. On the 5th attempt, the lawyer finally picked up, his voice carrying none of the composed neutrality it had held that afternoon in the estate. "You were given the assets," Henderson said, choosing each word like he'd rehearsed them, though in truth he hadn't expected to need them so soon. But Elias was given the ownership. Every account, every property, it was always structured beneath a single holding entity. "You are, as of tonight, tenants. At his will." The word landed harder than any of them expected. Tenants. In a penthouse they'd been raised to believe was etched into their names since birth. Julian laughed, but it came out wrong this time, thin and disbelieving. "That's insane. That's, Henderson, that has to be illegal. There has to be something we can." "There isn't," Henderson said simply. "I read the will you were given. I did not read the one he wrote." The sisters had gone quiet in the corner, jewelry catching the dim emergency light, trust funds suddenly feeling less like inheritance and more like something that could be taken back with the same silence it had been given. Marcus stood at the window, looking down at a city that no longer felt like it belonged to him, and for the first time in his life, he thought of Elias. Really thought of him the way you think of someone only once you've lost the power to ignore them. Elias stayed in Ohio through the night. He didn't call anyone, didn't check his phone, didn't need to. He already knew, with a certainty that felt strange in its calmness, exactly what was unfolding 4 states away. He sat at the desk in the vault long after the ledgers had been read and reread, the rusted key resting beside his hand, catching the white light in a way that made it look almost new. He thought about the version of himself who had walked into that reading room that afternoon expecting nothing, and gotten exactly what he'd expected. A joke, a punchline, a rusted piece of metal meant to remind him of his place. He thought about how close he'd come to believing them, the way he'd believed them for 5 years, the way believing had felt safer than hoping. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, his phone finally lit up. Not a call, but a message from Henderson, brief and almost formal. Asterisk, "They know. It's done. What would you like me to do next?" Asterisk. Elias looked at the message for a long time before answering. He thought about the shell companies buried in the ledgers, the names of officials Arthur had quietly paid to look the other way for 40 years, the zoning violations, and the money that had built empires nobody ever questioned because it had always arrived dressed as success. He thought about Marcus's Ferraris, purchased with money that had never really belonged to him. He thought about Julian's laughter, echoing across a room that had never once considered Elias worth looking at. "Freeze everything," he typed back. "Nothing moves until I say so." He set the phone down and looked around the vault one last time. At the binders, the terminal, the small velvet pouch that had once held nothing but a worthless piece of scrap metal in everyone's eyes but his own. Arthur hadn't just handed him a fortune in that cellar. He had handed him the only thing that had ever made the sterling name mean something. The truth, kept for 40 years, waiting for someone patient enough to be trusted with it. Elias picked up the key one last time, closed his hand around it, and for the first time since he'd stood in that reading room and taken the laughter without flinching, he allowed himself something close to a smile. The forgotten nephew was gone. What remained now sat quietly in his place, and the family that had mocked him would spend the rest of their lives learning exactly what that meant. The days that followed unspooled slowly, deliberately, exactly the way Elias wanted them to. He didn't rush back to New York. He let the silence stretch, let his cousins sit in their frozen accounts and darkened penthouse and imagine every possible version of what came next, because imagination, he'd learned, was often crueler than any punishment he could design himself. When he finally returned to the city, it wasn't through the front door of the estate. He arrived at Henderson's office instead, the rusted key sitting in his coat pocket like something sacred now instead of scrap. Marcus and Julian were already there when he walked in, seated stiffly on the opposite side of a conference table that had once decided their entire lives without asking them to lift a finger. Neither of them laughed this time. Neither of them could. "We can talk about this," Marcus started, his voice missing the confidence it had carried in that reading room. "Family doesn't have to mean. You didn't think that a week ago," Elias said, and it wasn't anger in his voice, just fact, laid down flat and impossible to argue with. "A week ago I was furniture. Now I'm inconvenient. Nothing about what I am has changed. Only what I hold." Julian's jaw tightened. He looked, for the first time in his life, like a man calculating something other than his own advantage. Like a man realizing, too late, that the ground beneath every privilege he'd ever taken for granted had always belonged to someone else's mercy. "What do you want?" he said finally. Not a challenge. The room stayed silent a long moment, the kind of silence that comes only after the truth has finally been spoken by the one person everyone had spent years refusing to hear. Nobody answered him right away. Marcus stared at the ledgers without opening them, as though the weight of what was inside might rearrange itself if he simply refused to look. Julian's hands, usually so certain, so used to holding things that were never truly his, sat folded on the table like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. It was Henderson who finally broke the silence. His voice softer now than it had been in that reading room, softer than Elias had ever heard it. "Arthur asked me something once," he said. "Years ago, before any of this. He asked me what kind of man deserves to inherit an empire. I told him I didn't know. He said he'd know it when he saw someone who never once asked him for anything." Henderson looked at Elias, and something like respect passed briefly across his face. "I understand now." Elias didn't need the validation, but he let it settle anyway, the way you let warmth in after a long time standing out in the cold. He turned back to his cousins. "The accounts unfreeze tomorrow," he said. "Not because you've earned it back. Because punishing you forever isn't the same as justice. And I don't want to spend my life proving I'm better than you by becoming someone Arthur wouldn't recognize." He paused. "But everything moves through me now. Every decision, every dollar. If that's a problem for either of you, that's a conversation we can have. But it isn't a negotiation." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once in his life, there was nothing left to say that would change the outcome, and some old, stubborn part of him finally understood that. Julian simply nodded, slow and hollow, a man recalibrating an entire identity built on assumptions that had just been quietly dismantled in front of him. Elias left the office before either of them could recover enough to respond. Outside, the city moved the way it always had, indifferent, relentless, unaware that an entire fortune had just changed hands in a room on the 40th floor. He didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. He felt something steadier than that, something that didn't need an audience to be real. He drove back to Ohio that weekend, alone, the way he preferred most things now. The farmhouse still stood crooked and weathered above the vault that had changed everything, and Elias sat for a long while on its sagging porch steps, the rusted key turning slowly between his fingers. He thought about the boy who used to fetch tea in a house that never once looked at him. He thought about the man Arthur had quietly, patiently, been waiting to see emerge from him. And he understood, finally, that the key had never been worthless. It had simply been waiting for someone who wouldn't mistake its weight for nothing. The forgotten will was no longer a secret. It had never really been about money at all. It had been Arthur's last and only way of saying, without ever needing to say it aloud, "I saw you. I always saw you." Elias closed his hand around the key one final time, and for the first time in 5 long years, the silence around him didn't feel like being overlooked. It felt like being trusted.